Hello guys, so this BTEC Sport and Exercise Sciences video is part of Unit 2 Functional Anatomy, and we're starting to look at Learning Aim C, which is all about the respiratory system. This particular video focuses in on the sort of anatomical structure of the respiratory system, the parts that make up the respiratory system and the job that they do, and this is C1. So just to start with, a little bit of an overview. We have an atmosphere, an environment around us. We have an external environment. We have air, which includes the oxygen that we need to get into our body. The air also has some nitrogen in it and some CO2 in it. But ultimately, we need to get that air from our external environment into our body, down our air tubes, down into our lungs, each side, and into the little air sacs, so that we can get the oxygen diffused into our blood, which transports the oxygen around for us, around our body. And in terms of sport, we need this oxygen to get to our muscles, the muscle tissues, the skeletal muscle tissues. That will use it to make energy to make those contractions work. Now, this is relevant to aerobic exercise, where type 1 fibers use oxygen, use food, and mitochondria make energy to make those muscle fibers contract. It might apply also to type 2A, which can work aerobically. We will learn that when we make energy, we produce carbon dioxide. So we have this waste, this byproduct of CO2, and that is diffused into the blood, which is transported back via the heart and eventually back to the lungs, which ultimately we need to breathe out and get rid of. So respiration involves air from the environment, rich in oxygen, being taken into the internal environment, transported in our blood. The oxygen, obviously, is what we want. Taken to the muscles. The CO2, this byproduct or waste product from cellular respiration, is removed from our muscles, taken away in our blood, back via the heart, back up to the lungs where we can breathe it out. That's the overview. And actually, this diagram gives you a version of that, but incorporates a few bits of terminology that you need to understand. So let's just orientate the picture. So we've got pulmonary circulation. Blood from the heart goes to the lungs to get oxygenated, i.e. diffusion happens there. We get our oxygen in, we give off our CO2 we want to get rid of, and of course the lungs go up, the trachea up to the nose and the mouth, we breathe it out. The oxygen-rich blood, the oxygenated blood, goes to our heart and it's ejected via our aorta and goes off to our bodies. In terms of us, we're going to talk about muscles. This is called the systemic circuit or the systemic circulation. That rich oxygenated blood goes off to our body systems, our muscular systems, where we diffuse the oxygen into our muscles, we diffuse the CO2 into the blood, and we take this blue-coloured deoxygenated blood back to the heart, which pushes the deoxygenated blood up to the lungs, and the process starts again. So it's very much this ongoing process of oxygenating blood via the heart, pushing the oxygenated blood to the muscles, deoxygenated blood from the muscles back to the heart and back up to the lungs. So firstly, try to understand that this is the pulmonary circulation. Anything lungs is pulmonary. And then this is the systemic circulation. Over here we've got a diagram it actually talks a little bit about a separate topic, how we control our breathing and regulate our breathing. Obviously it's to do with our brain, but we have respiratory muscles that change our thoracic volume, and our lungs change shape. From this, really try to understand these terms. Pulmonary ventilation, the getting air into and out of our lungs, getting air into and out of our lungs is pulmonary ventilation. Pulmonary means lungs. External respiration is the diffusion that happens at the lungs. It's more external. It's nearer the outside of our body. Okay, so it's called external respiration. That's diffusion at the lungs. Then we transport these gases. We transport the gases in our cardiovascular system. We'll look at that more when we look at the cardiovascular system. Then we've got internal respiration. Internal respiration is what happens at the muscle cells. It's more inside our body. It's more internal compared to the external respiration. So internal respiration is the gas exchange that happens at our muscles. So some bits of terminology there. Pulmonary ventilation is the breathing in and out of air, getting air from the external environment, the atmosphere, and into our body, into our lungs. External respiration is how we get that oxygen from our lungs into our blood and how we get that CO2 into our lungs. So it happens at the lungs. And internal respiration is the diffusion of oxygen into our muscles and the diffusion of CO2 into our blood that happens at the muscles, more internal. So some slightly confusing bits of terminology to get your head around there. Looking more specifically then, the anatomy of our respiratory system. We need to understand what these things are, what parts these are, what components these are, what they're made like and how they do a particular job. So this is the list from your specification, and these are the things that you need to know. Where are they? How are they built, and what do they do? Just to start by a brief sort of overview. Now, this isn't completely detailed. It shows most things. So we've got our nasal cavity. We've got our nose. Air can go in our nose and out of our nose. We've got this cavity, this space behind our nose. We've got the pharynx, which is the back of the throat, basically. Pharyngitis is inflammation of our throat. When you've got a sore throat, that's what it is. Obviously, we've got our mouth and our mouth cavity. Mouth and nose meet at the pharynx, particularly clearly there. But this is our trachea, our main air tube going down from the sort of back of our throat, down past the larynx and taking air into the two lungs. But here, it's not labelled and it's not particularly clear, is a little flap, cartilage flap called an epiglottis. And that we'll mention in a minute, really important. So the main air tube divides into a left and right side, going into the left and right lung. Remember, you've got to imagine you're laid on the paper. This is left, this is right. Into smaller air tubes. So this bronchus is the air tube going left and right. Then we've got bronchioles. We've got little air sacs at the end. We've got this big sheet of muscle called the diaphragm that divides the thoracic cavity, the chest cavity, to the abdominal cavity below where all our intestines are. We've got ribs, of course, making the chest cavity. We've got two layers of muscles between the ribs called our intercostal muscles. They're not labelled on this, I don't think. No. And then we've got these pleural membranes. So you can't see it particularly clearly, but each lung is sitting in a double-layered membrane, and we'll talk about those. So that's a really sort of simple overview of the components of the respiratory system, and as I said, you need to know what they are, how they're built, and what job they do. So let's start with the nasal cavity. Obviously, you can pause each slide. I'm going to go through it fairly swiftly. You can pause each slide to take in the information a bit more slowly, but to give you some summary. So our nasal cavity is this big space behind the nose. Obviously, air can come in and leave via this cavity, this nose cavity. Obviously, there's a mouth cavity as well, oral cavity, where air can go into. We breathe in our nose or our mouth. But the reason it might be preferential to go in, to have air come in through our nasal cavity, is because it is structured with a couple of things that help us. So air in the environment is dirty, there's lots of particles in it, cold and dry, generally speaking. The advantage of it breathing in through our nose is that our nose has little hairs, little cilia lining the nasal cavity. Now those little hairs filter the dust particles and the particles of stuff we don't want to go down into our lungs. So it's like a cleaning mechanism. We've also got mucus layers in the nasal cavity, and it's basically like sticky glue. So again, some of the particles get stuck in the mucus. I mean, actually, we swallow it for the most part, but it stops them going down into our lungs. We don't want these foreign bodies or these particles going down into our lungs. So the cilia and the mucus protect us by cleaning the air. Also, the nasal cavity is a warm space. The surface area enables us to, using our body temperature, warm the air and moisten the air. which makes it preferable for us rather than having cold, dry air. So the nasal cavity has cilia and mucus and a large surface area. It's a relatively big space so that it can clean and warm and moisten the air. Okay, that's that. Pharynx, larynx, and epiglottis. So our nasal cavities up here. Our pharynx is the sort of back of our throat. Now, this is a tube basically connecting the nasal cavity to the larynx and the esophagus below. Remember, food comes in our mouth and it has to come down this as well. So the pharynx is basically a connecting section of the system. Our larynx is our voice box. So that is some muscle and some cartilage that when air comes in or where we push air out when we talk, it vibrates and allows us to speak. Again, so it's a connection between the pharynx above it and the trachea below it. Here's our trachea. Now, importantly, note that here is our food tube, our esophagus. I think this is American. We spell it with an O, I think. So we've got an air tube, our trachea, and a food tube, our esophagus. Now, importantly, up here, you can see this paler bit here sticking up is the epiglottis. Now, the epiglottis is essential. When you eat something and you swallow it, this epiglottis covers the trachea, covers your air tube, because what we don't want is that food or drink going down our air tube and into our lungs. That would be bad. So this epiglottis flaps over the opening of the trachea, forcing the food to go down our food tube into our stomach. Happy days. Obviously, when we breathe in and we want air to go into our lungs, it's up and allows the air to come in. Sometimes, if it goes down the wrong way, you probably appreciate that phrase, this epiglottis hasn't done its job, and maybe a particle of food or a little bit of food goes into our trachea and we cough. When we cough, we try to push it back up again. So this epiglottis is really essential. It's a cartilage flap that covers the trachea to basically direct food or drink down our esophagus and to stop it going into our lungs. Our trachea then, so our larynx is the voice box here. Air comes in our mouth, in our nose, down our pharynx, down through our larynx, and down this main air tube, the trachea. Now, the trachea's got a very clever design. So they've taken a cross-section here, and this is the cross-sectional view. You can see that basically it's a C-shaped. So this is the front, this is the anterior view. This is the food tube, the esophagus, which would be posterior. So the trachea is C-shaped cartilage rings. You can see these blue things are the cartilage rings. Now, this is not a solid tube because when we move and when we breathe, we need it to be quite flexible. We change position. We don't want it to be rigid. We don't want it to collapse either. So we've got this cartilage that allows us to be flexible but keeps it vaguely structured as well. And at the back, the smooth muscle. So trachea is made up of C-shaped cartilage sections, keeping it flexible but preventing it from collapsing. Okay, so this is our main air tube going down to the point where it comes to a junction and we want air to go into the left and right lungs. Now, this is the bottom of our trachea, and this is showing going into the left and right lung. So it's shown here, look down our trachea, going into the left lung, and the picture has been taken from there and enlarged. So a bronchus, the singular is bronchus. This is the left bronchus. This would be the right bronchus. But if we're talking about both of those, we call them bronchi. So that's the plural, bronchi. Bronchus is so 1, 2 bronchi. This is showing the left bronchus. Okay? So again, it's a subdivision of the trachea. And the bronchus actually takes the air into the left lung in this example, whereby it branches into several of the lobes of the lungs. Lobes, there's basically sections of the lungs, and the bronchus will divide and send air into each of those lobes. The other thing to note is the trachea is obviously a bit bigger, the bronchi get a bit smaller, and then as the bronchus divides into these secondary bronchus or bronchi, they become a bit smaller branches. It's like a tree. This is the main trunk. We've got a big branch, smaller branches, okay, and these will spread through the lungs. I said that the trachea divides into a left and right bronchus, and the bronchus takes the air tubes and takes the air into the different lobes of the lungs. And can you see on this diagram, the left lung, this one, has 2 lobes, 1, 2, a big one and a little one. Note the language, inferior. This lobe is inferior to this one. This one is below. Superior means above. This is the superior lobe, this is the inferior lobe. This lobe has 3 lobes, this lung, the right lung, has 3 lobes, superior, middle, and inferior, above, middle, below. Hopefully you can recognize that your heart would sit in this space just left of center, and that's why this left lung only has 2 lobes, because the heart takes up some of its space. So these lobes are hanging or suspended inside the pleural cavities. So these lungs are wrapped by a double-layered membrane called pleural membranes. We'll look at that in a moment. And this is basically inside, this is what is inside the chest cavity or the thorax. So air comes down, goes into left and right, spreads down these bronchi, and we'll talk about these smaller bits shortly. Okay, so we've got the end of our bronchus. Remember, it started from a bigger bronchus, slightly smaller branches, and we're getting to these particularly small branches called bronchioles. So the next sort of size tube down, these are respiratory tubes, is called a bronchiole. And there are different sort of names of the bronchioles. You won't need to know all the different ones. You'll just need to know these smallest branches are called bronchioles. These bronchioles get smaller and smaller, increasingly narrow, 1 millimeter air tubes, tiny. And by the time they get to the end, these smallest ones, they don't have any cartilage. There were cartilage on the trachea, there was cartilage in the bronchi, and as the bronchus divides left and right, and the smaller bronchi. But by bronchioles, there's no cartilage. So now it's just smooth muscle in the walls of the bronchi. If you've ever had bronchitis, it's inflammation of these air tubes. They get mucousy, they get inflamed, they get a little bit larger and sore. But this is smooth muscle in the walls of the bronchioles. If I just go back to this slide, what we can see is these smaller branches. So we had our big trunk of the tree, the main air tube. The next sort of size down of branch are the bronchi. We've got sort of the bronchi, or this bronchus, divides and goes into the different lobes of the lung, 2 this side, 3 this side. Then we've got these smaller branches that actually spread the air all over the lung tissue, all over the extremities of the lungs. And those are bronchioles. Those are bronchioles. So let's look at the alveoli on the ends of the bronchioles. So air's come down the trachea, it's split left and right in the bronchi, it spreads throughout the lungs in the bronchioles, and now arrives at these alveolar ducts, these big big sort of bunch of grapes, really. This is the sort of stalk of the grape, and we've got lots of these single alveoli air sacs. Now, these are really essential because important stuff happens here. So these tiny alveoli, tiny alveoli, are individually, the wall of an alveolus, which is the singular, is 1 cell thick. And the reason it's 1 cell thick is because through this alveolus walls, gas exchange. Oxygen goes one way, CO2 comes the other way. So we need it to be thin to enable easy diffusion. You can see also that there are obviously lots of them. Whilst they're tiny little air sacs, we've got a lot of them. We've got 300 million little individual alveoli air sacs. Now, the reason we have 300 million is because even though individually it's tiny, because we've got so many, we create a massive surface area. So if you think about it, if this was just one singular air sac, the surface area total would be relatively small compared to us having loads of individual ones. It's a bit like having one big balloon versus millions of small balloons. You get more surface area having more small air sacs. And the reason surface area is important because the more surface area we have, the more diffusion can take place through these walls. So individually tiny, but we have so many, we get a large surface area for diffusion of our two gases, oxygen and CO2. It's also important to realise, and this diagram shows it quite nicely, is that surrounding the air sacs are the blood vessels that we diffuse oxygen into. So we diffuse oxygen through the wall of the alveolus into a capillary, and off it goes, oxygenated. So this, the red denotes where oxygen is diffused from the alveolus into the capillary and is going to be going off to eventually our muscles. The blue denotes deoxygenated blood coming back with lots of CO2 in it, and from the capillaries we diffuse through the capillary walls into the tiny thin alveoli, through the walls of the alveoli into the air sacs, where we then breathe it out. So in both cases the gases can diffuse easily through these tiny thin walls, and to be honest, capillaries have very thin walls too. They're only 1 cell thick, making diffusion really easy. There's a slightly bigger diagram of the analveolus. So this is one air sac showing the tiny thin 1 cell thick, so the blobby parts of that image there are cells, showing how thin the walls are, and that makes it easier for oxygen to diffuse into the blood and CO2 to diffuse from the blood into the alveolus, and of course we breathe it up and out of our bronchioles. The other thing just to note is that the single cell wall of an alveolus can be described as being semi-permeable. So it allows certain size and types of gases to permeate through it, to go through it. Obviously we want it to travel, for these two gases is all we'll have to talk about, but we need them to be able to move through the cell walls easily. So the alveolus wall is semi-permeable and allows oxygen and CO2 to diffuse through them easily. It's also quite moist as well, which helps it diffuse through as well. Going back to the anatomy of our respiratory system then, you need to understand what the chest cavity or the thorax is. The thorax is basically the cavity created by the ribs, the sternum, and of course the vertebral column is at the back, but our ribs wrap around and meet at our sternum here. And the lungs are suspended inside our thoracic cavity. Remember that the vertebrae at the back are called thoracic vertebrae. And this is related to when we breathe. We change the shape and the size and the volume of this thoracic cavity. The diaphragm is the bottom of the thoracic cavity. Okay? So this is related to, this area is related to how we breathe and move air in and out of our lungs. It doesn't show it brilliantly well on this diagram, but if you remember, these are cartilaginous joints. We need our chest to be able to expand a bit when we breathe in. Your chest moves up and out when you breathe in and then goes back down and in when you breathe out. So if this was a fixed joint or a fibrous joint, we wouldn't be able to expand that chest. So there are cartilaginous joints here where the lungs meet the sternum. The probably new bits of anatomy and possibly harder to get your head around is something called pleural membranes. So we have 2 layers of pleural membrane. It kind of shows it. So this is, you can see it's a cross-sectional view. They've chopped through the respiratory system there, and they're showing you here. It's a superior view. We're looking from above down somebody's body. We can orientate it. We know that this is the front, this is the anterior part, this is the posterior part, the back and the front, because this is our vertebral column, and you can see the spinous process there. That would be our spinal cord. This would be the main part of our vertebrae. Okay? The heart is in place, so the heart's just slightly left side. We've got 2 lobes in our left lung and 3 lobes in our right lung. But what I'm trying to show you with this diagram is that you can see this sort of layer going around here, layer coming around here, and it's a continuous layer. There's no end and start. It's like a double-layered plastic bag. So this is a double-layered sac that the lung is contained in, and the same applies over here. So we've got this outer layer, which is continuous, just loops around and carries on with this inner layer, a double-layered sac. Each lung sits in a double-layered pleural membrane or membranous bag. Now, the two layers have got names. The outer layer, which is effectively connected to or lines the chest cavity. So this is our rib cage. This outer layer that lines the rib cage, the chest cavity, is called the parietal pleura. Pleura is single, pleural membranes is multiple, two of them. So the outer layer is called the parietal pleura. The inner layer, which lines the lungs, the lung tissue itself, so the inner layer is called the visceral pleura. You need to be able to label them both, parietal, visceral, a double-layered, continuous sac that each lung sits inside. So what's the business with all these pleura or pleural membranes? The diagram shows our outer layer, parietal pleura, and our inner layer, the visceral pleura, the inside bag, lining the lung. The outer lines the chest cavity, the thorax. Inside we've got this yellow colouring. This is called the pleural space, the space between. And actually, there's some pleural fluid inside. Now, you may or may not be able have been in a pub or somewhere or at home, and you put a glass down or a cup down on the coaster, and when you pick it up the next time, the coaster comes up with your glass or with your mug. And it's generally because there's some fluid on the bottom of the cup or the glass, which actually makes it stick together. It acts as a vacuum. It sucks the coaster up with your glass or up with your mug. And this is how these layers of membrane work, actually. So a vacuum is created in here. It's multifunctional. When we breathe in and out, our chest cavity moves up and down and in and out. There's a lot of movement. This outer layer protects our lung tissue. We don't want this friction damaging our delicate lung tissue. So that one role of the pleural membranes is to protect the lung tissue. The other is to, with this vacuum created by the pleural fluid, is to enable our lung tissue to be expanding. So when our rib cage goes up and out, the parietal membrane goes with it, and because this vacuum makes these two membranes kind of work together, the inside membrane, the visceral membrane, is pulled out as well, and the space inside gets larger. So when the ribs move, so does the lung tissue, so does the volume inside. So a confusing topic, you will need to be able to label the two membranes. You'll need to know that it's a double-layered continuous sac. It's protective primarily, and it also enables the lungs to move with the rib cage movement. Okay, nearly done. So, respiratory muscles then, really important to enable us to breathe in and sometimes breathe out. So you should already know our diaphragm, this big sheet of muscle at the bottom of our lungs, and it divides our thorax with the abdominal cavity below. This is a inferior view, so this is looking up at somebody's diaphragm. And there's obviously spaces for your food tube, your trachea to go through, your vertebral column to go through, some blood vessels to go through. But this is looking up at somebody's chest cavity at this big sheet of muscle dividing the thorax and the abdomen. Now this muscle is essential for breathing movements. You will learn that when it's dome-shaped like this, it's relaxed, and when it's contracted, it flattens. This is often something students get confused with. So it's relaxed, dome-shaped, contracted, flattened. What it does when it flattens is it creates a bigger space inside our chest cavity. It changes the volume of our chest cavity, and we'll get to that in a different video. You also need to know that you've got other respiratory muscles. So your, where are we? Here we are. Between your ribs, you've got 2 layers of intercostal muscles. You've got internal ones, they're on the inside. You've got external intercostals, they're on the outside, and they're actually in different directions. So you've got, shown nicely here, look, you've got internal intercostal muscles, and you've got external intercostal muscles, basically 2 layers of muscles between your ribs. Inter means between, inter. The job of the intercostal muscles is to help us move when we breathe, our chest cavity to move. The external ones, outside ones, pull our rib cage up and out when we breathe in. Our internal ones, when we breathe out forcefully in exercise only, pull the rib cage forcibly down and in. Only when we're exercising, not at rest. We'll come to that in a different video. So always in external intercostals help us breathe in, rest and exercise. The internal intercostals only work when we're exercising and forcibly breathing out. Just be aware also that we have what we call accessory muscles. We have extra muscles that help us breathe in and breathe out when we're exercising, as well as our diaphragm and our intercostal muscles. So you should already know sternocleidomastoid, scalene muscle, which is a little sort of neck-related scapular muscle here, pec minor, they're the main ones you might need to know. The accessory muscles that help us breathe out forcibly when we're exercising only are things like your rectus abdominis, the six-pack muscle on the front of your abdomen, some of the more deep, so rectus abdominis is more superficial, more knit towards the surface. Deeper muscles beneath the surface are your obliques, external and internal obliques. Actually, there's also something called, or latissimus dorsi helps you pull your ribcage down sometimes as well to breathe out also. But the principle of this is there are extra muscles when you're forcibly breathing out, in and out, only during exercise that help your breathing movements. So there's a summary of the anatomical components of the respiratory system here. By all means, pause and have a look at that. Lastly, just to finish, to show you some of the ways questions might come at you. So I haven't got the diagram for this question, but it says identify the letters in figure 1 that shows the location of the nasal cavity and the epiglottis. So obviously there's a diagram of the respiratory system, and it wants you to correctly identify these 2 anatomical components. Then explain the function of the epiglottis. So this would be 2 marks and this would be 2 marks for completion of that. So what is the job of the epiglottis? It's a flap of cartilage that blocks the trachea to stop food going down it when you swallow. Here's another one. Explain the function of the alveoli for 4 marks. So function of the alveoli, gas exchange, it's semi-permeable membrane. It's a short diffusing pathway to make it easier for the diffusion to happen. It's where oxygen and CO2 are moved into and out of the blood and the lungs to breathe out. Here's another one. What are the components A and B? Label them and describe the function of the diagram during inspiration, 5 marks. So the trachea, the bronchus, and then you have to describe what the diaphragm does during the breathing movements. So you might get some that are purely anatomical, identify or label, but you definitely get some having to explain the jobs of the parts of this system.